Will you pretend to be my daddy for just one day? The maid's toddler asked the billionaire. His response shocked everyone. She was 3 years old. Her shoes were too small. Her dress had a small tear near the hem. Her hair was pulled into two uneven pigtails because her mother had done it in the dark, before the sun came up, before she rushed to catch the bus that would take her across town to clean someone else's house. And she stood there, this tiny, barefoot little girl, in the middle of a marble hallway that cost more money than her mother earned in 10 years. She wasn't crying. She wasn't afraid. She looked up at the man in front of her, a man in a tailored suit, with cold eyes and a reputation that made grown adults nervous, and she said something so simple, so pure, so devastating, that the entire room went still. She said, "Will you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day?" No one moved. The housekeeper standing nearby pressed her hand over her mouth. The security guard near the door looked away. And the billionaire, the man who had fired 3 executives that morning, who had not smiled in years, who had walls around his heart built from grief and silence, stood completely frozen. He had faced hostile boardrooms. He had survived a bankruptcy. He had buried his son. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. What he did next would change both their lives forever. But before we get there, before we understand why this little girl asked that question, why this man responded the way he did, and what the truth was that no one in that house knew yet, we have to go back. We have to go back to the beginning. To a young woman named Elena. To the night she made a decision she thought would destroy her. And to the secret she had been carrying, alone, for 3 years. Because what happened in that marble hallway was not an accident. It was the end of a very long, very painful road. And it started with a storm. Elena had the kind of beauty that she never noticed. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that turned heads at parties or stopped conversations. Hers was the quiet kind, the kind you notice slowly, like light coming through a curtain in the morning. She had dark eyes that carried something deep behind them. A stillness to her face. A softness that came not from weakness, but from years of choosing gentleness over bitterness. She had every reason to be bitter. She was 26 when her mother died. 27 when her father, overwhelmed by grief and debt, sold the small house they had grown up in and moved to a different city without telling her. She learned about it from a neighbor. She called her father. He picked up once, said he was sorry, and never answered again. Elena had one friend, one small apartment, and a cleaning job that paid just enough to keep the lights on. She was not the kind of person who complained. She was not the kind of person who asked for help. She had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs without ever asking the world for anything in return, and she had learned to carry her own weight the same way, quietly, completely, without letting anyone see how heavy it was. She started working for the Mercer household when she was 28. The Mercers were not one family. They were an empire. James Mercer had built a real estate company from nothing, from literally one inherited property and a stubbornness that his competitors mistook for arrogance. By the time Elena came to work in his house, he was worth over $4 billion, owned properties in 11 countries, and had been on the cover of 3 major business magazines. He was 45, widowed, and known in every room he walked into before he ever said a word. His house wasn't a house. It was a statement. 12 bedrooms. A kitchen that looked like a restaurant. Gardens that went on longer than Elena's entire street. A library with a ladder on wheels. A staff of 9 people who each had a specific role and specific hours and specific rules about where they were allowed to walk. Elena's role was simple. She cleaned the West Wing. She changed linens. She polished things that were already clean. She did not speak unless spoken to. She did not ask questions. She came in through the side entrance, clocked her hours, and left. For 3 months, she never saw James Mercer up close. She heard him. The low voice on phone calls that drifted through hallways. The click of expensive shoes on marble. The sound of a door closing, not slamming, just closing with a kind of finality that made you understand the conversation on the other side was over. His estate manager, a precise woman named Mrs. Harrow, ran the staff with military efficiency. Everyone had a schedule. Everyone had a place. And Elena, who had always been good at making herself small, fit perfectly into the system. She was grateful for the routine. After the chaos of the last few years, losing her mother, losing her father, losing the version of herself she thought she was going to be, routine felt like mercy. She woke up. She took the bus. She cleaned. She went home. She slept. She did it again. She told herself she was fine. She almost believed it. Until the night of the storm. It was October. Late October. The kind of cold that comes before the real cold. The warning cold, the kind that says something is changing. Elena had stayed late to finish deep cleaning the East Library. Mrs. Harrow had asked her to stay, and Elena never said no, because the extra hours paid for the heating bill. By the time she finished, the sky had opened up. The kind of rain that doesn't come with a warning. The kind that hits all at once, like a wall. The kind that turns streets into rivers in 20 minutes. She stood at the side entrance, coat over her arm, staring out at the sheets of water, and she had no umbrella, no car, and the last bus of the night had already left. She was calculating whether she could run to the bus shelter 3 blocks away and call a cab she couldn't quite afford when she heard a voice behind her. It wasn't warm. It wasn't particularly kind. It was simply factual. You shouldn't be standing there. You'll get soaked before you reach the gate. She turned around, and for the first time, she looked at James Mercer up close. He was taller than she expected. His face was harder than photographs showed. Not cruel, but carved, like something that used to be softer and had been worn down by years. He was holding a glass of something amber-colored, and he was looking at her the way people look at a problem they're trying to solve quickly. She told him she was waiting for a cab. He told her the roads near the highway were already flooding and cabs were avoiding the area. She said she would figure it out. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that sees more than it's supposed to, and then he told her she could stay in the guest room near the kitchen until the storm passed. She almost said no. She should have said no. But the rain was loud, and she was tired, and something in her, the part that had been alone for so long it had forgotten what it felt like to be helped, said yes before her brain could stop it. That night changed everything. Not the way movies make it look. Not immediately. Not even obviously. But something shifted that night. Something small and irreversible. And 9 months later, Elena was sitting in her apartment, holding a positive pregnancy test, completely and utterly alone. She sat on the edge of her bathtub for a long time. Long enough for the light outside to change. Long enough for the sounds of the street below to shift from evening noise to night quiet. Long enough to go through every thought a person can have in that kind of moment. The fear, the calculation, the grief, the strange flicker of something that wasn't quite joy but was adjacent to it. She was going to have a baby. She was alone. She had no savings. She had no family. She had a cleaning job and a 1-bedroom apartment with a radiator that clanked all night. And the father was one of the most powerful men in America. She never told him. She knew, even as she made that decision, that people would judge her for it. They would say she was selfish, or scared, or foolish. They would say he had a right to know. They would say she should have called, written, left a message with Mrs. Harrow, done something. But they didn't know what she knew. She knew what happened the morning after the storm. She knew how James Mercer had looked at her across the kitchen table, not with cruelty, but with a kind of terrifying composure, like a man who had already sorted the situation into a category and closed the file. She knew what he had said, that what happened was a mistake, that he hoped she understood that she should continue her position if she chose to, but that they would not speak of it again. No anger, no apology, just management. He had managed her, and she had looked at him, at this man who moved through life like nothing could touch him, who had walls so high you couldn't even see the top, and she had thought, "This man doesn't know how to love anyone." She thought about his son, the one who had died. She had heard the story from the other staff, a car accident, 2 years before she started working there. A teenage boy named Daniel. The whole house still carried the grief of it, like a smell you couldn't wash out. Photos of him lined one hallway that James Mercer never walked down anymore. A man who had lost a child. A man who had built walls to survive that loss. A man who, Elena feared with every part of herself, would either try to control the child completely, out of the same desperate love that had curdled into control over everything else in his life, or reject it entirely to protect himself from more loss. Neither option felt safe. And so she made her choice. She quit the job. She said it was for personal reasons. Mrs. Harrow accepted the resignation without much sentiment. Elena packed her small apartment, moved to a different neighborhood, and disappeared into the ordinary world the way only truly poor people can. Because when you have nothing, no one looks for you very hard. She found work cleaning offices at night. She found a neighbor, an older woman named B, who watched babies for cash. She found a free clinic. She found a way. She always found a way. Her daughter was born in March. A Tuesday. A quiet birth, the kind that comes without drama but not without pain. Elena named her Sophie. Sophie came into the world with dark eyes, her mother's eyes, and a serious expression that made the delivery nurse laugh and say she looked like she was already thinking about something important. Elena held her and cried. Not from sadness. Not exactly. From the weight of love. From the terrifying size of it. From the understanding, immediate and irreversible, that this small person was now the reason for everything. The reason to wake up. The reason to work. The reason to not fall apart when falling apart would have been so much easier. Sophie was perfect. Sophie was everything. For 3 years, Elena built a small, careful life around her daughter. She worked nights when Bea watched Sophie. She worked days when Sophie napped. She took every extra shift she could find. She skipped meals so Sophie could have better ones. She read to her every night even when she was so tired the words blurred. She sang her songs she half remembered from her own childhood. Sophie was bright and curious and fierce. She asked questions about everything. She named all of her stuffed animals and gave them complicated backstories. She had opinions about clouds. She talked to strangers without fear in a way that made Elena's heart stop and sing at the same time. She was 3 years old when she started asking about her daddy. Elena had expected it. She had prepared for it, or thought she had. She had little answers ready, gentle answers, the kind designed to satisfy, without wounding. But Sophie was not easily satisfied. She had seen the fathers at the park. The ones who pushed the swings and caught kids at the bottom of the slide and carried their children on their shoulders like little kings. She had watched them with the quiet intensity she brought to everything, and then she had looked at her mother with those deep dark eyes and said, "Where is my daddy?" Elena said, "He lives far away, baby." Sophie said, "Does he know about me?" Elena paused a beat too long. Sophie filed that pause away. Children always do. She didn't ask again for 2 weeks. And then Bea got sick. Bea's daughter came to get her on a Thursday, a quiet, sad afternoon, and just like that, the only childcare Elena had was gone. She couldn't afford a daycare. The waiting lists were long. She had shifts she couldn't cancel, without losing the contracts. She did the only thing she could think of. She called Mrs. Harrow. She asked if there was any work, anything, that would allow her to bring a small child along. There was a pause on the line. Then Mrs. Harrow said that Mr. Mercer had asked for additional help for the month, that she could start Monday, that she was welcome to bring the child. Elena told herself it would be fine. She told herself he would never even see Sophie. She was wrong about that too. She almost turned around 3 times on the way there. Once at the bus stop, when Sophie fell asleep on her shoulder and looked so peaceful that the idea of carrying her into that house, into that world, felt like a violation of something sacred. Once at the gate, when the security guard checked her name against a list, and Elena had the sudden, nauseating realization that she was back, that she had told herself she would never come back, and here she was, with her daughter on her hip, standing at the edge of everything she had run from. And once in the side corridor, when she caught a glimpse of the hallway she had cleaned for years ago, and the smell of the place, clean and cold and expensive, like marble and fresh flowers, hit her with a physical force, like a memory she had tried to bury pushing up through the ground. She kept walking. She had a job to do. Sophie, for her part, was not intimidated. She looked at the marble floors and the high ceilings and the enormous windows, and she said, with complete confidence, "It's like a castle, Mama." Elena said yes, something like that. Sophie said, "Do kings live here?" Elena said no, just a regular person. Sophie didn't look entirely convinced. The arrangement was that Elena would clean the west corridor and 2 of the guest bathrooms, rooms James Mercer never used, while Sophie sat in a small room near the kitchen with a bag of toys and a drawing pad. Mrs. Harrow had been matter-of-fact about it, as she was about everything. The kitchen staff would check on the child periodically. It would be fine. It was fine for 3 days. Sophie was remarkably well-behaved in that small room. She drew pictures with total absorption, horses, clouds, a recurring figure she called the princess, and ate the crackers Elena packed for her and talked quietly to her stuffed rabbit. On the 4th day, Sophie got curious. Elena had stepped into the adjacent bathroom for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. She came back, and Sophie was gone. The panic was immediate and total. She searched the kitchen, the corridor, the small garden outside the kitchen door where Sophie had pressed her face against the glass twice, enchanted by the roses. And then she heard a voice, Mrs. Harrow's voice, low and careful, from the direction of the main hallway. She followed it, and she stopped in the doorway, because Sophie was standing in the middle of the marble hallway, barefoot, because she had pulled off her shoes in the warm kitchen, looking up at James Mercer. He was there, by chance. Or something that looked like chance. He had come down for a document or a meeting or something practical, something that had a reason that had nothing to do with this moment. He had turned a corner and found a small child standing in the hallway of his house, looking up at him with no fear at all. Elena couldn't breathe. She watched her daughter look at this man, this tall, formal, guarded man, with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, and she saw something pass across Sophie's face. Something Elena couldn't name. A recognition that didn't make sense, that had no logical basis, that seemed to come from somewhere wordless. James Mercer had gone very still. He was looking at Sophie the way people look at something that surprises them, not just with its presence, but with something underneath its presence, some quality they weren't prepared for. Sophie tilted her head. She said, "You look sad." A muscle moved in James Mercer's jaw. He said very quietly, "Do I?" Sophie nodded. She said, "My mama gets that face sometimes. When she thinks I'm not looking." Elena pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. She needed to go in there. She needed to take her daughter and apologize and get Sophie back to the small room and close the door on this moment before it became something it shouldn't be. But she couldn't move. Because James Mercer had crouched down. This man who did not crouch for anyone. This man who ran a billion-dollar empire from behind a wall of composed certainty, had crouched down to Sophie's level and looked at her and said, "What's your name?" Sophie said, "Sophie." He said, "How old are you, Sophie?" She held up 3 fingers. He looked at those 3 fingers for a long moment. Something in his face changed. It was subtle. The way light changes when a cloud moves, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. Something shifted behind his eyes that Elena couldn't read from where she was standing. And then Sophie said the thing that stopped time. She said, "Will you pretend to be my daddy? Just for one day?" The hallway went completely silent. Mrs. Harrow, standing nearby, went rigid. The kitchen staff member who had wandered to the doorway stepped back. Elena felt the ground tilt under her feet. And James Mercer, who had not been surprised by anything in years, looked at this tiny girl with her uneven pigtails and her serious dark eyes and her complete, fearless honesty, and he said nothing at all. He just looked at her. And Elena, watching from the doorway, saw something she had never expected to see on that carved, controlled face. She saw grief. Raw and old and enormous. And something else underneath it. Something she couldn't identify yet. Something that made her blood run cold for reasons she didn't fully understand. Not yet. James Mercer stood up slowly. He did not answer Sophie's question. Not directly, not immediately. He looked at the little girl for one more long moment, the kind of look that contains an entire interior world, and then he straightened and the mask came back, and he was composed again. He said to Mrs. Harrow that the child should have a snack from the kitchen. He walked away. Elena finally found her legs and moved into the hallway. She scooped Sophie up, murmured apologies to Mrs. Harrow, and carried her daughter back to the small room without meeting anyone's eyes. Sophie, unbothered, asked if she could have apple slices. Elena said yes. She sat down on a low stool in the corner of the kitchen while someone cut apple slices for her daughter, and she stared at her own hands and tried to remember how to breathe. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself he hadn't noticed. That children say things like that all the time. That he had probably forgotten it already, had already moved on to his next meeting, his next decision, his next thing to manage. She told herself she was safe. She was wrong. 3 hours later, Mrs. Harrow came to find her. She said, with her usual precise neutrality, that Mr. Mercer would like a word. Elena's heart dropped through the floor. She followed Mrs. Harrow to the study, a room she had cleaned but never been in while it was occupied, and the door closed behind her, and she stood on the other side of a large desk from James Mercer, who was looking at her with an expression she could not read. He let the silence run for a moment. Then he said, "How old did you say your daughter was?" She said, 3. He said, "When is her birthday?"
She said, "March."
He said nothing. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Watched him do the arithmetic of dates and months, and the one night she had tried so hard to keep sealed in a compartment marked mistake and over and never again. She wanted to say something, to explain, to frame it, manage it, get ahead of it. But he spoke first. He said, "I lost a son." She already knew that. He said his name was Daniel. He was 17. He died in a car accident on a Tuesday in March. She had known the exact date. He said, "The same month your daughter was born." The room felt very small. He said, "When Sophie looked at me in that hallway, I don't know how to explain this. I don't believe in things I can't explain. But she looked at me the way Daniel used to look at me. That same stillness. That same directness."
He stopped.
I know that sounds irrational. Elena didn't say anything. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, a gesture so human, so unguarded, that it didn't match the man she thought she knew. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly."
She said, "Okay."
He said, "Is Sophie my daughter?" The silence that followed was the longest of Elena's life. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times over 3 years. She had imagined all the versions. The angry version, where he accused her. The cold version, where he dismissed it. The legal version, where men in suits got involved. She had imagined every version except the one she was actually in. This quiet room, this unguarded man, this question asked without rage or threat, asked with something that looked terrifyingly like hope. She looked at him.
She said, "Yes."
He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just 1 second. And in that second, Elena saw 3 years of his life. The grief, the silence, the walls, the controlled composure, crack, just slightly, at one edge. He opened his eyes. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She told him the truth. All of it. The morning after the storm. What he had said. How he had looked at her. What she had been afraid of. What she had decided, alone in her apartment, holding a pregnancy test. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He said, "You were protecting her." She said, "I was protecting both of them." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she hadn't expected. He said, "I said something unforgivable to you that morning. I know that. I've known it for a long time, longer than you'd expect. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to let me."
He stopped.
Started again. He said, "She asked me to pretend to be her father. And I don't want to pretend." And just like that, the entire shape of everything changed. Before we go further, because I know this story is hitting something deep, I want to pause for just a second and ask, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. The city, the state, wherever you are in this world. I love knowing who's on the other side of this screen. And if this story is moving you, if you're feeling something right now that you weren't expecting to feel, please subscribe. And share what this is bringing up for you in the comments below. Your stories matter here. This community was built for people who feel things deeply, and if there's a theme, an emotion, a situation you want me to explore next, tell me. I read every single comment, and your words shape what I create.
Now.
Back to Elena. Back to Sophie. Back to the man sitting across that desk who had just said the words that would change all three of their lives forever. Elena drove home in a kind of stunned silence that Sophie, usually a reliable narrator of everything she observed, seemed to sense was not the moment for talking. She sat in her car seat with her stuffed rabbit pressed against her cheek and looked out the window at the city going by, and she didn't ask questions. Elena was grateful for that in a way she couldn't have expressed. She needed space to think. What had just happened? Not the facts of it. The facts were simple enough. James Mercer had figured out the truth. He knew Sophie was his daughter. He had said he didn't want to pretend. But what did that mean? What did any of that mean in practice? She had spent 3 years building a life that was small but stable. She had built it on the foundation of her choices, her decision to leave, her decision to be silent, her decision to do everything alone. And now the thing she had most feared, discovery, exposure, the collision of Sophie's world with James Mercer's world, had happened not through drama or accident or legal action, but through a 3-year-old walking barefoot into a hallway and asking a question with her whole heart. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She did both after Sophie was asleep. Quietly in the kitchen, with the lights low and a cup of tea going cold in front of her. The next morning, Mrs. Harrow called. She said Mr. Mercer would like to meet again. This time with his lawyer present. He was not using the lawyer against Elena. She needed to understand that. He wanted to formalize things, not to take anything,
To give.
Elena asked what that meant. Mrs. Harrow said she thought it best to hear it from him directly.
She went back.
This time Sophie stayed with the kitchen staff, who had, apparently, fallen collectively in love with her overnight. There were drawings on the refrigerator. Someone had brought her a small book about horses. Elena sat across from James Mercer again, and this time there was a lawyer, a quiet woman named Ms. Chun, with kind eyes and a professional stillness that felt designed to be non-threatening, and James Mercer slid a document across the desk. Not a custody claim. Not a paternity suit. A trust. He had set up a trust in Sophie's name. Education, housing, healthcare, everything covered, unconditionally, regardless of what happened between him and Elena. He wanted nothing from Elena. He was asking for nothing. He was not going to courts, not going to press, not going to the media. He was offering Sophie financial security she would have for the rest of her life. And he was asking, not demanding, for the chance to meet her. Really meet her. Not through a cleaned hallway or a marble foyer. To sit down and know his daughter. Elena stared at the document.
She said, "Why?"
he said, because I've spent 2 years after Daniel died building walls, protecting myself from loss by eliminating the possibility of love. And I've been very successful at it.
He paused.
And then a 3-year-old walked into my hallway without shoes on and looked at me like I was a person. Another pause. I forgot what that felt like. Elena thought about Daniel. The hallways she had never walked down. The photos she had caught glimpses of. A boy with dark eyes and a wide smile that his father no longer had. She thought about Sophie. She said, she deserves a father. A real one. Not someone who treats her like a responsibility or a legacy. She met his eyes. If you're going to be in her life, you have to be in it. Not when it's convenient. Not when you remember. Every day. He said, I know. She said, you don't know yet. But I believe you mean it.
She signed nothing that day.
She took the documents home. She read them 3 times. She called the only person she trusted, her friend Mara, from the old neighborhood, and read them aloud over the phone. Mara said, Elena, this man is trying to do right by your kid. Elena said, I know. Mara said, then let him. But things were not that simple. They never are. Because 2 weeks after that meeting, something happened that Elena had not anticipated. Someone talked. One of the kitchen staff, probably innocently, probably just a whispered conversation in the wrong ear, mentioned to a friend that there was a small girl at the Mercer estate who looked like she belonged there, who had dark eyes like Mr. Mercer's son, who called him the Sad King when she thought no one was listening. That whisper reached a journalist. And then it reached the internet. And then Elena's phone started ringing from numbers she didn't recognize, and she stood in her kitchen staring at a news alert that read, Billionaire James Mercer's secret daughter? And the careful, quiet life she had built began to shake. The first call came from an unknown number at 6 in the morning. Elena didn't answer. The second call came at 6:15. The third at 6:30. By 7, there were journalists outside her building. She could see them from the second-floor window, 2 of them with cameras standing near the entrance, waiting. Sophie was still asleep. Elena stood in the kitchen in her socks and her old robe, and she felt the world closing in with a speed she hadn't prepared for. She had always known in the abstract that this was a risk, that secrets don't stay secrets forever, that James Mercer was a public figure, and that anything connected to him existed in a kind of harsh, unforgiving light. But knowing something abstractly and living it at 6 in the morning with your daughter asleep in the next room are 2 very different things. She called James Mercer's number, the one he had given her 2 weeks ago, quietly, without ceremony, as if providing it were the most natural thing in the world. He picked up on the second ring. He already knew. His team had been monitoring. His PR manager had called him at 5:30. There was a containment plan being activated. She and Sophie would be moved, if she consented, to a secure location, not his estate, somewhere neutral, while the story was managed. She said she needed to think. He said she had about 20 minutes before the story would be picked up by major outlets. She looked around her apartment, at Sophie's drawings on the fridge, at the row of small shoes by the door, at the life she had built with her hands and her silence and her solitude. She said, James, if I do this, if I let you manage this, it has to be on my terms. Sophie's terms. Not yours. Not your PR team's. Not the media's. He said, tell me what that looks like. She said, it looks like us telling the truth. Our version. Not a spin. Not a press release. The actual truth, that I made a decision out of fear, that you made a mistake years ago, and that now we're both trying to do right by a little girl who doesn't know any of this is happening. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that will cost me. She said, I know. He said, okay. She didn't expect that. Not that quickly. She packed Sophie's things while Sophie slept, carried her down the back stairs wrapped in a blanket, and got into a car that was not a car but something between a car and a fortress. Sophie woke up halfway through the drive, looked around at the leather interior and the tinted windows, and said, "Are we going on an adventure?" Elena said yes. Sophie said, "Good. I've been waiting for one." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Elena's adult life. Not because of the media was handled mostly by people who were very good at handling it. Not because of the financial complexity, Miss Chen navigated that with quiet efficiency. Because of Sophie. Sophie, who was 3 and perceptive and had begun to notice that the sad king appeared more often now. That he came by the secure residence with flowers for Elena and a small stuffed horse for Sophie, a roan-colored one, because Sophie had told Mrs. Harrow once that brown horses were her favorite. That he sat in the chair by the window and read to her in a voice that was stiff at first and slowly, awkwardly, became something warmer. Sophie, who watched this man with those serious dark eyes and asked Elena one night, while being tucked in, "Is he trying to be my real daddy now, Mama? Not pretend?" Elena smoothed her hair. She said, "He's trying."
Sophie thought about this.
She said, "He's not very good at it yet." Elena said, "No. But he's learning." Sophie nodded. She seemed satisfied with this. She said, "That's okay. I'll help him." And Elena, sitting in the half-dark of her daughter's temporary room, felt something shift deep inside her, something that had been rigid and defended and necessary for survival starting, slowly, carefully, to soften. But the story was not over yet, because there was something Elena didn't know. Something James Mercer had been carrying that he hadn't told her. A piece of the truth that connected to that October night 4 years ago, that connected, in ways she hadn't imagined, to the accident that had taken Daniel, and to the choices James had made in the years since, and to the reason his walls were as high as they were. And it was about to come out. Not from him. From someone who had been watching all of this unfold with an agenda Elena hadn't suspected. Her name was Victoria Mercer, James Mercer's sister-in-law, his late wife's younger sister. A woman Elena had never met, had barely known existed, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. She gave an interview, not to a tabloid, to a respected magazine, carefully written, positioned as concern, as the voice of the family, the voice of reason, the adult in the room calling out what she described as a manipulation. The headline called Elena a woman who had deliberately targeted James Mercer during a vulnerable period of grief, who had gotten pregnant strategically, who had spent 3 years positioning herself for maximum leverage. Elena read it at 2 in the morning on her phone, alone in the kitchen, and her hands went cold. It was so precisely, surgically designed to damage her. Every real fact had been twisted slightly. Her quitting the job became fleeing before she was fired. Her silence about the pregnancy became calculated waiting. Her return to the estate became a planned reappearance. Her agreement to meet with James became negotiation. It made her look like a predator. And Sophie, her brave, bright, trusting little girl, was described as an instrument. Elena sat in the dark for a very long time. She thought about running. Not figuratively. Literally. She thought about packing Sophie's things and the stuffed rabbit and the roan horse that James had brought and disappearing again. Going somewhere new, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one could reach them. She could do it. She had done harder things. She sat with that thought. And then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, dragging her blanket, looking at her mother with those dark eyes. She said, "Mama? Why are you crying?" Elena hadn't known she was crying. She opened her arms. Sophie climbed into her lap. Elena held her daughter in the dark kitchen and breathed in the smell of her hair and felt the small, warm weight of her and understood something with total clarity.